Thank you so much for a good introduction. Okay, I know, first of all, thank you for attending on the last day of the conference, the last session. I know I'm the only one standing between you and the gala dinner, so I will be ruthlessly efficient and try to finish on time, if not earlier. Here is an outline of my talk. I'm going to talk about acculturation model and intersectionality. I'm going to present on the role of media in understanding migrants and talk about multiculturalism and why it matters when we are studying migrant issues, and provide some reflection on future directions. I think it is important to start with some statistics showing that majority of people in the world, they are not migrants. Only 3.6% of global population are international migrants. This indicates that most of us do not leave the country of our birth. And this pattern can have been stayed the same similarly from 1960s to 2020. Nevertheless, 281 million migrants is a sizable population, and of course requires studying this topic from multiple perspectives, including psychology. Here's a definition of acculturation for those in the room, and generally scholars who study acculturation. This is largely used, and by anthropologists offer that is just looking at various phenomena, cultural shift that happens when people from multiple groups come into contact. We made a minor modification in this definition. We removed continuous first-hand to include acculturation that happen as a result of remote acculturation. People don't need to come into first-hand contact for these changes to happen. But also, in addition to cultural shift, there are behavioral and psychological changes that happen at individual level. So I'm going to focus my attention on some of the studies that have been conducted on newcomers, migrants and refugees. I'm using the word migrants loosely here, recognizing that, of course, there's a distinction between migrants and refugees and asylum seekers. Research shows that there are certain factors that consistently predict adaptation of migrants. These include social support. Social support could come in terms of structural support that exists in a society, or informal support, neighbors or friends provide support to each other. Identity matters, multiple identities associated with better adjustment. Competency matters when you are in a different country. If you speak the language, if you're competent in a culture, it contributes to your adjustment. Resilience, psychological strength, those are all positive indicators of adaptation. But there are, of course, discrimination, hassles, barriers that hinder adaptation. We also know the acculturation orientation or tendencies, attitudes, they also associated with adaptation. Here is a model that we developed back in 2003, and essentially consists of, talks about these factors, what you saw as consistent variables that predict adaptation. You see here competency, resilience, identity, and hassles that are associated with negative adaptation. In terms of adaptation, this is sociocultural adaptation is essentially what immigrants do. Doing well, engagement in the context, and feeling well, psychological adaptation. Nobody migrates to a new country in order to become depressed, anxious, having a stress associated with life. We also know that acculturation strategies that is based on two dimensions, they are associated with adaptation. In this model, we look at this in terms of mediating variables. So we have contextual factors and we have behavioral measure, and this works as a mediating variable. Similar model independently was developed by late Van der Weiber in his lab, and colleagues in 2006 in Europe. So this model is pretty similar with another model that has been well established in the literature. So what I'm going to show you is just a series of studies that we have conducted testing this model with different immigrant groups. These are various papers that we have done. And essentially, I'd like to show you this statistical model that shows some association between these variables and outcomes. Certain patterns is consistent. So we know that people who engage, immigrants who engage, who have high level of or perceive high level of hassles, they have more distress. People who have more resources, they have low level of distress. But I'd like to draw your attention to these mediating variables because this is the line of work that is now getting a lot of attention among some acculturation researchers. Specifically, we know that having tendency toward maintaining your own culture and tendency to participate in the new culture and acquire new culture predicts the outcome variable. It predicts how well immigrants do and feel. This is amongst Iranian in Canada. So the next model is that testing the same thing amongst Iranian in United States. What you see here, people's Iranian immigrants' tendency toward acquiring the new culture did not predict the outcome variable. That is, amongst this particular immigrant, feeling positively inclined toward American culture did not mean, or it did not translate that they will engage with American culture. If immigrants are viewed as a problem in a society, they are less likely to be welcome and accepted. The next model is amongst immigrants in the UK. This is Iranian immigrants in the UK. And you see that not only new culture acquisition does not predict or consistently, the own culture maintenance similarly doesn't predict how immigrants are doing. The next one, Iranian in Netherlands, similar pattern. The mediating variables are not working. So overall, what we have here is that acculturation strategies tend to not consistently predict adaptation. There is something else is happening here. And this is consistent with a recent meta-analysis conducted by researchers in Norway. And they argued that positive orientation doesn't necessarily lead to sociocultural adaptation. This relates to other aspects of what is happening in the larger society. So I'd like to put two other studies with the immigrant groups in Canada and see how it works in terms of the acculturation strategies. We find that separation, integration, and assimilation, they do predict outcome variable. In fact, those who are inclined to assimilate or integrate, they are more likely to engage with out-group. Those who incline in separation engage with in-group. The first one was the Indian immigrants in Canada. This is Russian immigrants in Canada. More or less similarly, we find these mediating factors predict the outcome, but the pattern is slightly different. What we have here, essentially, is that amongst Russian immigrants, the last slide you saw, these immigrants tend to rely more on in-group contact to maintain their cultural cohesion, their cultural support. Amongst Indian immigrants in Canada, who are visible minority, they tend to engage with more out-group contact. So acculturation orientation works, it predicts outcome, but the slightly different pattern amongst these two immigrant groups in Canada. Overall, we have this, that again, social support, competency, all of those factors, they tend to predict cultural adaptation, but acculturation orientation, at least within Canadian context, it works slightly differently, although it differently amongst immigrant groups, and the pattern tends to be unique to different ethnic groups amongst Russian versus Indian in this case. We have data from Syrian refugees as well, international students as well. But this is generally the bigger picture that you see here. So moving on, I presented you with asking people about adaptation of immigrants in general, but didn't mention anything about intersectionality. Of course, intersectionality is important when we are looking at different disadvantage, different social inequality that exists in the society, and you can look at it from different lens. In this study, we looked at particular aspect of intersectionality. We collected data before I move on to methodology, we looked at specifically the stereotype content model that is based on 2 dimensions. When we interact with someone, we subconsciously rate them on the dimension of warmth and competence. Warmth would be to the degree that we think someone is sociable, the degree they are trustworthy, sincere, and we also rate people on the level of competency. When we meet someone, to what degree they are competent or intelligent, they have a set of skills. Participants in our study were over 1,000 individuals. The majority of them were students, but we have about 20% who weren't students. These are all Canadian-born, their parents are Canadian-born. And we run the study in terms of vignette-based experimental survey design. So participants were randomly divided. When they log into the website, they randomly divided to read a vignette. We kept certain things constant, and they read about an immigrant who's coming to Canada, and we asked them to rate this immigrant on warmth and competency. So the age of immigrant stayed consistent, education, job credential stayed consistent. This is an important factor. So all these immigrants have the same credential. But what we manipulated is where they come from. Some of them, they were British, Chinese, Nigerian, and Iranian. Gender, we manipulated that, and sexuality. So we said some of these immigrants are gay, lesbian, and some of them are heterosexual. And then we asked them, so what do you think in terms of warmth and competency? So let's focus on warmth first and amongst heterosexual. You find that in general, women, they are perceived, women immigrants perceived as high warmth, that they are women generally sincere, trustworthy, compared to men. The difference between this British is not significant. But among same-sex immigrants, men are considered to be high warmth compared to women. It is the association of being gay and femininity that plays the role here. Gay immigrants, they are considered to have high warmth, not lesbian immigrants. In terms of competency, aside from the fact that 2 ethnic groups, Chinese and British, they are perceived to be high competent, we find men generally to have higher level of competency, both for straight and same-sex participants. The only exception here was the Black lesbian migrant, Nigerian, as if they're already breaking the stereotype. Therefore, they are perceived to have high level of competence. When we put all these together, look at the top 2 lowest in terms of positive stereotype and the top 2 highest in terms of positive stereotype. Iranian male heterosexual and Nigerian male heterosexual have the lowest kind of warmth and competence. British male heterosexual, Chinese male gay had the highest level of competency and warmth. The rest of the group had more mixed kind of perception that they received from the group. What we have here is a pattern of prototypicality. Generally, heterosexual male are representative of the group. And that's how they are perceived by others. The biases that are directed toward groups generally these biases are based on what is considered to be a generic ethnic group that is male heterosexual of that group. The non-prototypical immigrants are generally female, same-sex, and visible minority. Heterosexual women as a group also had this paternalistic view that was found that most fell into this high warmth and low competence. So how do these immigrants are represented, or migrants and refugees are presented in the media? Generally, there are two assumptions that media is important by not just psychologists, communication scholars, that it is important to look at how media represents socio-political issues around the world. And people's understanding generally comes from the media about migration issue and others. And the media plays an important role in creating and recreating how we understand other people, specifically migrants here. Here's an example of British newspaper. You see that these headlines, things like open borders, a new fiasco, it's sensationalizing what migration is all about. This is the British newspaper, the Daily Mail. This is American headline from various American newspaper. So new data shows many Americans share Donald Trump's anti-migration view. So giving voice to this kind of very migrants are problem. And this one is the Canadian, these are headlines from various Canadian newspaper, and again, say no to mass migration. Canada is also gearing up toward election very soon. So the print media essentially portray immigrants as a problem. The last quotation you see here, Europe is no longer Europe, it is Eurobia, a colony of Islam, where the Islamic invasion does not proceed only in a physical sense, but also in a mental and cultural sense. This is by Oriana Fallaci, passed away, Italian journalist, 2005. But this particular quotation has been reproduced and used in the media in current years as well. So the media tell us it's a problem. Migrants are problematic and we need to resolve it. We did a study looking at discourse analysis of how migrants and refugees are presented in Canada. And we looked at over 600 articles, 2 national newspapers, 4 provincial papers in 4 major cities in Canada, Calgary, Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, and used the discourse analysis to look at the pattern, what we find in these articles. And we found one of the major findings was that there is immigration system in Canada is presented as it is broken. It needs fixing. There is a lot of fraud happening in our immigration system and something needs to be done. So given that it is broken, our politicians need to get tough, need to do something about this. We need to categorize, separate good migrants from bad migrants. So here's an example how an issue is redefined in the media. There is significantly higher number of visible minorities in Canada in labor force who are either underemployed or unemployed. And in the media, they tend to either, this is downplayed or not discussed much. And if it is discussed, it is generally presented that as migrants don't speak one of the official languages. They don't speak English or French, therefore they can find a good job. Yet there is little emphasis on the fact that Canada has one of the toughest regulatory training. And yet having those training is their ticket to come to Canada. And of course, there are discrimination and barriers in terms of integrating migrants in the institutional and various work settings. And there are lots of literature on that. In fact, there is a very well-known joke in Canada that the best place to have a heart attack is the back of a taxi cab because the chances are your driver is a doctor. And in fact, it has been recited by Canadian politicians as well. So immigration tend to be presented like this, and there are problems that in the society we see that it is the way it is talked about. How can what could the larger society do? And that's multiculturalism and interculturalism that focuses this part of my talk that focuses on this. In a recent paper, we did a critical analysis and compared particular integration policies that countries have. And we looked at interculturalism and multiculturalism. By multiculturalism, I don't mean something vague. I mean something specific. Canada was the first country that established multiculturalism policy in 1971, and it is based on certain principles, including that all Canadian cultural groups, it is the responsibility of the federal government to make sure all cultural groups, they can enhance, share their cultural heritage. We need to come up with creative ideas to bring people together. We need to promote, to avoid cultural barriers so people can integrate into Canadian society, and of course, assist people to learn official language. It's important, sometimes even in a scholarly article, this point is not well emphasized. Multiculturalism is not just cultural diversity, it's also about cultural inclusion. That is, all groups need to be able to participate in the society in equitable manner. This is very different from interculturalism. Interculturalism exists in Europe as well. I'm going to focus within the Canadian context due to the time limit I have. Quebec explicitly, the French-speaking part of Canada, explicitly rejected multiculturalism. And this is the cover of book for Gerard Bouchard, who's the main architect of interculturalism in Canada. There are overlaps between multiculturalism and interculturalism, and both of them, they argue that diversity is a good thing. We want immigrants in Quebec and the rest of Canada. They also say that both policy would argue, or it is within their principle, that minority groups should be encouraged to maintain their heritage culture. We don't want them just to assimilate. It's different from assimilation. But how they are different is that French language is considered to be the primary means of communication. In fact, several scholars in Canada, including Richard Burris, they specifically look at the policies that Quebec has in terms of businesses, what kind of design they have. It has to be in French. And if they are using a second language in the signs, the font has to be a certain size. It cannot be bigger than the French language. There is an emphasis on secularism within interculturalism, which doesn't exist in multiculturalism. And the way it has been explained the two is that multiculturalism is an egalitarian pluralism, while interculturalism is hierarchical pluralism. Both of these, multiculturalism and interculturalism, has been reinterpreted and understood differently in different contexts. Again, we have looked at the context in Europe as well. And here are some examples that is just one of the early politicians who knocked down multiculturalism, Angela Merkel, who said multiculturalism has utterly failed. Jeb Bush, a decade later, said similar thing. US should not have a multicultural society. And most recently, UK, the Home Secretary said, a misguided dogma of multiculturalism has proved toxic for Europe. But multiculturalism cannot fail if it hasn't been realized in any of these countries. None of the three countries I mentioned have a policy of multiculturalism. In fact, political theorists, Perrick and others, they talk about a distinction between multicultural as a demographic characteristic. Almost every country we know of, it is multicultural in terms of demographic characteristic, but it is different when we talk about normative or other characteristics. So the policy component and how people view multiculturalism. So let's see in countries like Canada, when we have multiculturalism, how it has impact on people's perception. Am I okay in terms of time? In terms of perception of migrants. That's the paper we looked at. We made a direct comparison between multiculturalism, interculturalism, and assimilation. Three policies that tend to dominate in different societies. We had over 500 participants. These are, again, Canadian-born, parents Canadian-born, and it's experimental design, and people randomly assigned to one of the conditions when they assign into the site. So people had to read something about the three characters, the interculturalism, multiculturalism, and assimilation. Everything else about the vignette stayed consistent. Under interculturalism, people read that when immigrants integrate successfully with our, we believe that immigrants integrate successfully when our legislation, our programs recognize the importance of Canadian belief while respecting Syrian refugees. We specifically focus on Syrian refugees because Canada accepted over 20,000 Syrian refugees, and there were some reaction to that. Under multiculturalism, we said that we believe immigrants integrate successfully when our legislation acknowledged Canadian culture isn't more important. Again, remember, that's the egalitarian pluralism. Under assimilation, it says that immigrants integrate successfully when they adapt Canadian identity and culture. We also manipulated threat versus no threat. Under threat condition, we said that Syrian refugees are Muslim. They tend to come to Canada, and they tend to not to stick together and form their own community. So we create this symbolic threat that they don't integrate. Under no threat condition, we didn't say that the statement was not included. So here is the finding. We looked at a number of variables. This is particularly social dominance orientation, the trait variable. We find that as social dominance increases, not surprisingly, under no threat, regardless of what condition they were, the evaluation of Syrian refugees dropped. But when there was a threat condition, it was only multiculturalism that as social dominance increased, under multiculturalism, people still, they rated Syrian refugees more positively. So what we think is happening here is that multiculturalism tend to target people's belief on social dominance in terms of social dominance rather than promoting cultural diversity. And it works similarly as it reduces existential anxiety. There is a threat. Probably we need to foster a more inclusive environment. This socio-political climate of Canada, it is not accidental. Over 50 years, in fact, a couple of years ago, Canada celebrated 50 years of multiculturalism. Over 50 years, people develop a more positive attitudes toward migrants. This wasn't the case 50 years ago or at the beginning when multiculturalism happened. And this goes against in a political climate in other parts of the world that there is this view of migrants as something negative. Here is most recent data on migrant acceptance index. And it shows that, again, that Canada, 10 out of 9, the scale goes to 9. Canada scores amongst the top countries in terms of acceptance of immigrants. The top 10 countries that have the lowest level of acceptance are 9 of the 10 are the former Soviet bloc countries. 9 out of them are them. And the one country that is non-European is Israel. with the lowest level of acceptance of migrants. There are different interpretations of this, and of course, I would be happy to talk about this at a later time. And when we go back to Canada and we ask people, what makes Canada unique? It's not so much our association with the Queen or the King or any of those things. It is the multiculturalism, and that's consistent. This is 2021, embryonic. It's a data provides national statistic, and we consistently, Canadians say, multiculturalism what makes us unique. We have been able to demonstrate this in a study as well, what is referred to as social markers of acceptance. So we asked immigrants, this concept of social markers of acceptance by Singaporean researchers Leong was developed 2014, and subsequently other countries participated. And essentially asking members of the national community, what do immigrants need to do to become one of us? And we did mixed methodology. What we found was that generally Canadians think it is easy for foreigners to become one of us. What they need to do to respect freedom of choice, they need to accept and respect other cultures, and they need to appreciate the Canadian beauty. These are not difficult characteristics to learn. What we found, but when we ask them what are least important social markers of acceptance, they say it doesn't matter what cultural norms or behaviors you have. You don't have to physically resemble like us, and there is no specific religion. So we again find a similar narrative here in terms of acceptance of migrants. Word of caution, I am aware that what I'm presenting here, it seems like Canada is this amazing country with respect for values and rights of others. This is part of the story. Canada has dark history of, there is another strong narrative in Canada that is rejection of particular minorities, and specifically indigenous groups and Muslim immigrants. In fact, in my lab, we have been able to show that the narrative toward Muslim immigrants is much more negative than narratives toward other groups of immigrants. So where do we go from here? Is the United Nations has a vision for 2030 that says peaceful, just, and inclusive society. Those characteristics cannot be achieved if immigrants are not part of it. Social justice is an important aspect of the work that we do. Those of us work with migrants and acculturation issues, looking at healthcare, access to healthcare, access to education, employment, discrimination, and looking at those variables at different levels is an important aspect of the work we do. Migration and acceptance is a two-way street. If you don't want immigrants to hate you, don't hate them. Acceptance breeds acceptance, rejection breeds rejection. If we want Muslim immigrants in Canada to integrate within the Canadian context, Canadians need to develop better perception of Muslim immigrants. We also know that many of acculturation research have been conducted in global north. Migrants coming from global south, ending in global north. When we look at the patterns of migration, although it is true that 50% of international migrants come from developing nations or global south to developed nations, mostly global north, 1/3 of migrants go from developing to developing nations. This graph is just nicely shows that, for example, migrants from sub-Saharan Africa, although they go to America and parts of Asia and Europe, majority of them, they end up in neighboring countries. So we do need to look at that pattern of migration in order for us to have a better understanding of this acculturation. In fact, when we have We have done some studies within Global South, migrants, refugees going from Venezuela to Colombia. And what that research shows that South-South migration, to some degree, they face the same level of resentment, rejection that migrants from South-North face. We also know that South-South migration tend to be poorer. They have more, they have to deal with this illegal, undocumented situation, perhaps longer than those who end up in Global North. It's also important to look at the intersectionality. As you saw, the study we did on intersectionality, it matters what group of immigrants we are talking about. Immigrants that are fall into multiple social inequality, they have a different experience than immigrants that have fewer of those. And that helps us to have more nuanced intervention in terms of policymaking. So I like to acknowledge a team of students and former students who contribute to this line of 20 years of line of research. And thank you for your attention.